In this episode, we are stepping into a part of cybersecurity that often sounds highly technical, but is really built on a few disciplined ideas that beginners can understand clearly once the mystery is stripped away. Digital forensics is the practice of finding, preserving, examining, and explaining digital evidence in a way that helps an organization understand what happened, how it happened, and what that means for response, accountability, and future protection. For someone preparing for the CISA Certified Information Systems Auditor (CISA) certification, this matters because security events are not only about stopping harm in the moment, but also about building a reliable picture of the event afterward. That picture supports recovery, investigation, governance, and decision-making, and it only becomes trustworthy when the work is done carefully, methodically, and with a constant respect for evidence integrity rather than guesswork or dramatic assumptions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what digital forensics is not, because many people first encounter the idea through movies or headlines that make it look like instant technical magic. Digital forensics is not simply searching a computer until something suspicious appears, and it is not a race to see who can make the fastest accusation after an incident occurs. It is a structured discipline focused on collecting and interpreting digital information in a way that preserves meaning, minimizes contamination, and supports well-founded conclusions. The goal is not to confirm a favorite theory, but to determine what the evidence actually shows, even when that answer is incomplete or less dramatic than expected. This is why forensics is so valuable in security work, because organizations need more than alarms and suspicions when they are trying to decide whether data was accessed, whether actions were authorized, whether a user was compromised, or whether a system can be trusted again. At its core, digital forensics is about evidence, and evidence is only useful when people can trust how it was handled. That simple idea drives most of the major principles behind the field. If important data is changed carelessly, if records are collected without context, if investigators fail to document what they did, or if conclusions are built on assumptions instead of observed facts, then the investigation quickly becomes less reliable. A well-run forensic process tries to avoid that by emphasizing preservation, accuracy, repeatability, and documentation from the beginning. For a beginner, one of the most useful ways to think about this is to imagine trying to solve a puzzle where some pieces can disappear every minute and others can be damaged by careless handling. The more disciplined the process, the better the chance that the final picture reflects reality instead of the distortions created by the investigation itself. One of the most important principles in digital forensics is preservation, which means protecting evidence from loss, change, or confusion as early as possible. Digital environments are dynamic, and data can be overwritten, deleted, encrypted, rotated out of logs, or changed automatically by normal system activity. Even powering a system on or off can affect what information remains available. Because of that, forensic thinking begins with the question of how to stabilize the situation so the organization does not unintentionally destroy the very evidence it needs in order to understand the event. Preservation is not just a technical concern, because it also depends on coordination, timing, and decision-making under pressure. If one team tries to restore operations too quickly while another wants to understand what happened, the organization may have to choose carefully between business urgency and evidence value, and that balance is part of sound forensic methodology. Another foundational principle is integrity, which refers to confidence that the evidence being examined is the same evidence that was originally collected. This matters because digital information is fragile in a different way than physical evidence. A file can be copied, altered, renamed, partially overwritten, or mixed with other material in ways that are hard to notice later unless controls were in place from the beginning. Investigators therefore care deeply about showing that the evidence remained consistent and that any copies used for analysis truly reflect the original source. This is one reason forensic work often uses validation methods such as cryptographic hashing, which creates a mathematical representation that helps confirm whether data has changed. A beginner does not need to master the mathematics to understand the main idea, which is that trustworthy investigation requires a way to prove that the evidence analyzed today still matches what was collected at the start. Documentation is just as central as preservation and integrity, even though it may not sound as exciting at first. In digital forensics, documenting actions, times, sources, conditions, and observations helps create a record of how the investigation unfolded and why certain conclusions were reached. Good documentation answers practical questions such as where the evidence came from, who handled it, what was done to it, what systems were involved, and what limitations affected the findings. Without that record, even careful technical work can lose value because others cannot retrace the reasoning or confirm that the process was sound. This is especially important in large incidents, where several teams may be working at once and memories can become unreliable very quickly. For CISA learners, documentation is a familiar control concept in a new setting, because once again the quality of the process depends on whether actions can be shown, reviewed, and trusted rather than merely claimed after the fact. Methodology is the broader structure that keeps forensic work organized, and it helps prevent the investigation from turning into an unfocused search through overwhelming amounts of data. A sound forensic methodology usually follows a progression that includes identifying relevant sources, preserving evidence, acquiring the needed data, examining it carefully, analyzing what it means, and reporting findings in a form that others can understand and act upon. Different organizations and investigators may use slightly different models, but the discipline behind them is similar. The work should be systematic, repeatable, and aligned to the questions that matter most. This is important because digital environments contain enormous volumes of data, and not all of it is equally useful. Methodology helps investigators focus on relevant systems, relevant time periods, and relevant events so that the investigation remains purposeful instead of becoming a slow and confusing collection exercise without clear direction. To apply that methodology well, investigators need to understand the different kinds of digital evidence that may exist in an environment. Evidence can come from hard drives, mobile devices, servers, cloud platforms, applications, network logs, email systems, authentication records, removable media, and even devices that are not traditionally thought of as computers. Each source may tell a different part of the story. One system may show that a user authenticated successfully, another may show what files were accessed, and another may show that data was sent outside the environment shortly afterward. The real value often appears when those sources are combined into a coherent timeline instead of being examined in isolation. For beginners, this is a useful reminder that digital forensics is not just about looking inside one machine. It is about gathering enough reliable pieces from across an environment to reconstruct activity with reasonable confidence and explain what happened in a way that supports response and understanding. A closely related idea is volatility, which refers to how quickly certain data can disappear or change. Some information, such as active network connections, system memory, running processes, or recently opened sessions, may exist only while a system remains powered and in a certain state. Other information, such as files on storage media or preserved log archives, may remain available longer if handled properly. This creates an important investigative challenge because responders sometimes have to decide whether to collect fast-changing evidence immediately or prioritize containment actions that may reduce the available data. Those decisions are not always simple, and that is why preparation and trained judgment matter. A beginner should understand that not all evidence waits patiently to be collected. Some of it fades quickly, and an effective forensic methodology accounts for that reality by recognizing which data sources are most time-sensitive and how those sources may contribute to understanding the incident later. When investigators move from preservation into acquisition, the goal is to gather evidence in a way that supports accurate later analysis. Acquisition can involve capturing a full image of storage, obtaining a logical collection of selected files, preserving logs from central systems, collecting memory data, or gathering records from cloud services and applications. The right approach depends on the incident, the environment, the question being investigated, and the practical constraints of time and business impact. A full acquisition may provide a richer picture, but it can take longer and require more storage and processing effort. while a narrower collection may be faster but risk missing context that becomes important later. This is why methodology matters so much. Acquisition should be guided by the investigative objective and the value of the data, not by the impulse to collect everything without a plan or, on the other extreme, to collect too little and lose the broader meaning of the event. After evidence is collected, examination begins, and this is where digital forensics becomes a process of organized interpretation rather than simple observation. Examination involves identifying relevant artifacts, separating useful information from background noise, and determining what specific evidence may answer the questions at hand. Artifacts are the traces left by activity, such as log entries, timestamps, browser history, process records, user actions, account changes, file metadata, and communication patterns. Each artifact may be small on its own, but together they can reveal sequence, intent, access paths, or attempts to hide activity. The key here is discipline. An investigator should not jump too quickly from a suspicious artifact to a broad conclusion, because one trace can sometimes have multiple explanations. Strong examination, therefore, builds carefully from observations toward patterns, and from patterns toward conclusions that remain anchored in evidence instead of drifting into speculation. Analysis takes the examination results and asks the larger question of what they mean when viewed together. This stage often involves reconstructing timelines, correlating activity across different sources, comparing expected behavior with observed behavior, and identifying gaps where uncertainty still remains. Good forensic analysis is not merely technical pattern matching. It is a reasoned effort to explain how events likely unfolded, what systems or users were involved, what evidence supports those conclusions, and where the limits of certainty begin. This is particularly important because digital evidence can be both powerful and misleading if context is ignored. A sign-in at an unusual hour may suggest compromise, but it may also reflect legitimate remote work unless other evidence supports a darker explanation. That is why strong methodology insists on correlation and context. The goal is to construct the most reliable explanation the evidence allows, while remaining honest about ambiguity when the evidence does not fully close every question. Objectivity is another essential principle, and it deserves attention because investigators are often working in high-pressure situations where leadership wants fast answers. Once an organization suspects a certain user, malware family, vendor issue, or attack path, it becomes easy for people to start interpreting every new finding in a way that supports that early belief. That kind of bias is dangerous because it can lead the investigation away from the truth and toward a narrative that feels satisfying but is not fully supported. Digital forensics tries to resist that tendency by grounding conclusions in observed evidence, documenting uncertainty, and remaining open to alternative explanations until the facts narrow the possibilities. For beginners, this is a valuable lesson that applies beyond forensics. Good security work requires intellectual discipline, especially when pressure is high, because acting confidently is not the same thing as being correct, and a flawed conclusion can lead to flawed recovery, flawed reporting, and repeated exposure. Digital forensics also plays an important role in the broader incident response process, because it helps the organization move from suspicion to understanding. Response teams need to know whether an event is isolated or widespread, whether sensitive data was touched, whether the attacker still has access, and whether restored systems can be trusted. Forensics provides much of the evidence that supports those decisions. At the same time, the relationship goes both ways, because incident response actions can affect what evidence remains available and how difficult later analysis becomes. This is why coordination between responders and investigators is so important. If technical teams isolate, rebuild, or wipe systems too quickly, they may reduce immediate risk but also erase traces that would have answered key questions later. Mature organizations recognize that containment, recovery, and forensics must support one another rather than compete for control of the same event. Modern environments also make forensic work more challenging than many beginners first expect. Data may be spread across cloud services, remote endpoints, mobile devices, virtual systems, and third-party platforms, which means the evidence needed to explain one incident may live in several places under different ownership and retention rules. Encryption, logging gaps, short data retention periods, and massive volumes of routine activity can all complicate the process further. In some cases, the most important evidence is not missing because someone deliberately hid it, but because the organization never designed its systems to preserve it long enough to be useful. This is one reason auditors care about forensic readiness even when no incident is active. If logging, synchronization, retention, access control, and documentation practices are weak, then the organization may discover too late that it cannot answer the basic questions that leaders, regulators, customers, or investigators will ask after a serious event. When you step back from all of these ideas, digital forensics becomes much easier to understand as a disciplined search for truth inside digital environments rather than a mysterious technical specialty. Its principles center on preservation, integrity, documentation, objectivity, and methodical analysis, while its methodologies help investigators collect the right evidence, examine it carefully, connect it meaningfully, and explain it responsibly. For someone preparing for CISA, the most important takeaway is that digital forensics is not valuable because it sounds advanced. It is valuable because organizations need reliable ways to understand incidents, support recovery, guide decisions, and improve controls after something goes wrong. When handled well, forensic work turns scattered traces of digital activity into a coherent, defensible account of what happened, and that makes it one of the most important bridges between security operations, governance, assurance, and long-term organizational learning.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.